In the quiet town of Meadowgrove, a young boy named Isaiah, just 10 years old, was found by the police holding a newborn baby girl. The sight was both surprising and touching. Isaiah walked slowly down the empty street, his arms wrapped protectively around the baby, who looked barely a year old. His clothes were tattered and too large, clearly hand-me-downs that had seen better days. He shifted the baby in his arms with careful but strained movements. The child, a small white girl with fine wispy hair, clung to him as though he were the only thing she trusted. Her tiny hands gripped his shirt as she nestled her head against his shoulder. Isaiah's expression was one of deep focus, his young face lined with an unusual gravity as he concentrated on keeping his footing and holding her securely. A police car rolled by, its lights off, but still a silent, steady presence in the dusk. The officer inside, Officer Davis, noticed the boy right away. To him, the sight was strange, even suspicious. The neighborhood was quiet, and most families were indoors. Yet here was a young black boy carrying a white infant, looking exhausted and far from home. Officer Davis watched them for a moment, narrowing his eyes as his instincts began to kick in. He pulled his car to the curb, stepping out and moving toward Isaiah, his gaze hard and questioning. The sound of footsteps approaching made Isaiah freeze, tightening his grip on the baby instinctively. His heart raced as he looked up, seeing the officer's expression shift from curiosity to suspicion. The officer didn't wait for an introduction or explanation. He simply walked closer, stopping a few feet from Isaiah with an intense look in his eyes. There was already an assumption, a silent accusation waiting to be spoken. Isaiah's shoulders tensed as he glanced at the officer, his gaze flicking downward in a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Officer Davis took a breath, folding his arms and looking at Isaiah with a hard stare. He demanded to know what Isaiah was doing with the baby, his tone sharp and unyielding. The officer's gaze scanned over Isaiah's clothes, his bare feet, the dirt on his hands, and the exhaustion that clung to him. To the officer, it seemed impossible that this boy with his worn-out clothes and haggard expression could be responsible for a baby, a white baby at that. He couldn't imagine a reason that felt plausible, a reason that would explain why this child was holding a baby as though it were his sole purpose in life. Isaiah, though fearful, took a deep breath, instinctively holding the baby tighter. His mind raced, struggling to find the words that would make sense to this man in uniform. He had promised himself he would protect the baby, and even now, faced with the officer's accusations, he refused to loosen his grip. He looked back at the officer, unsure how to explain himself. The words caught in his throat. The baby nestled closer to him as if sensing his anxiety, and he shifted her weight to keep her from slipping. Her presence seemed to steady him, giving him just enough courage to meet the officer's gaze. The officer, misinterpreting the fear in Isaiah's eyes as guilt, stepped closer, his tone growing even firmer as he demanded answers. He suggested that Isaiah must have taken the baby from somewhere, perhaps even from her family, an idea that seemed almost ludicrous to the boy, but horrifying all the same. Isaiah could feel the knot of panic in his stomach tighten. He tried to shake his head, but the words still wouldn't come. His fear mounted as he realized the officer wasn't going to believe him without an explanation. Seeing no immediate response, Officer Davis grew more impatient. He repeated his question, this time louder, his voice cutting through the quiet street as he insisted that Isaiah let go of the child. But Isaiah's hold only tightened, his small arms trembling as he clung to the baby protectively. The officer's demand only seemed to make him more determined. His young face was now marked by a look of defiance mingled with desperation. He didn't know how to explain the bond he felt with this child or how much he needed to keep her safe. He only knew that letting go wasn't an option. The baby stirred in his arms, whimpering softly, as if sensing the tension in the air, and Isaiah soothed her gently, patting her back. Finally, Isaiah found his voice, managing a few words. His tone was barely above a whisper as he tried to tell the officer that he was taking care of the baby, that she was with him. But to Officer Davis, the words sounded feeble, an excuse crafted to avoid scrutiny. He shook his head, dismissing Isaiah's explanation without consideration, his expression growing colder. He told Isaiah that his story wasn't believable, that it sounded like something a guilty person might say to avoid responsibility. The implication sent a wave of panic through Isaiah. He clung tighter to the baby, his young mind racing for a way to protect her. His face betrayed a mixture of fear and hurt as he realized that the officer saw him as a threat rather than a guardian. He looked around as if hoping someone might step in, but the street was deserted. Alone, he looked back at the officer, his eyes filled with pleading as he silently willed the man to understand. But Officer Davis had already made up his mind. He stepped closer, his voice still stern, as he demanded that Isaiah hand over the baby. Isaiah's heart pounded, his mind torn between fear and his need to protect her. He whispered softly to the baby, promising her silently that he wouldn't let her go, even as the officer continued pressing him for answers. To him, this baby was his responsibility, and he would not break the promise he had made to keep her safe, no matter how frightening the situation became. The officer, seeing Isaiah's refusal to comply, began to lose patience. His hand moved to his radio as he prepared to call for backup. To him, this boy's resistance was a confirmation of guilt, a sign that something was amiss. Isaiah felt the weight of the officer's judgment, the unspoken accusations pressing down on him, and his heart filled with a silent resolve. No matter what happened, he would protect the baby in his arms, even if no one understood the truth of why he was doing it. As Officer Davis's questions grew more impatient, his tone sharper with each demand, another police car pulled up to the scene. A second officer, Officer Thompson, stepped out, glancing between Isaiah, the baby in his arms, and his colleague's frustrated expression. After a brief exchange, the officers decided that it was best to take Isaiah and the baby to the station. Perhaps, they reasoned, someone there would have better luck coaxing answers out of the boy, who seemed reluctant to let go of his story. Isaiah's heart sank, but he kept his hold on the baby, his resolve unwavering even as he felt a pang of dread at the station. The officers led Isaiah to a small room and called for a social worker. They offered him a chair, but he refused to sit, instead adjusting the baby in his arms to keep her comfortable. She was quiet but alert, her wide eyes observing the unfamiliar surroundings, her tiny hand clutching Isaiah's shirt. The social worker arrived shortly after, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Harris, who approached Isaiah with a gentle expression that contrasted sharply with the police officer's stern demeanors. Ms. Harris knelt to Isaiah's level, introducing herself softly as though trying not to disturb the baby nestled against his shoulder. She explained that she was there to help, that she only wanted to understand the situation. For the first time, Isaiah felt a small sense of relief. Her tone was warm, her eyes encouraging him to speak. He looked back at her, still hesitant, but the weight of the day's events had left him exhausted, and he knew he couldn't carry the burden alone much longer. Slowly, he began to tell his story. He explained that the baby's name was Lily, and that she was not just some random child he had stumbled upon, but the daughter of his former neighbor, a woman named Sarah, who had struggled for as long as he could remember. Isaiah's voice wavered as he described Sarah's life, the hardships she had faced, the small apartment they had shared on the same floor, and the steady decline as she battled addiction. His words painted a picture of a woman who had once been kind, but had been overtaken by struggles too heavy to bear. Isaiah told Ms. Harris how his own mother, noticing Sarah's struggles, had stepped in to help in whatever small ways she could. She would bring extra groceries, make meals, and care for Lily when Sarah was too unwell to manage. To his mother, kindness had always been second nature, a way of life she had passed down to her son. Isaiah had grown accustomed to Lily's presence, watching his mother soothe the crying baby, holding her with the same warmth and gentleness she had always shown him. But then, his voice breaking slightly, Isaiah spoke of the tragedy that had torn his world apart. Within weeks, both families were struck by unimaginable loss. His mother, who had been his entire world, fell ill suddenly and passed away, leaving him adrift. Only days later, Sarah succumbed to an overdose, leaving Lily with no one but Isaiah. He choked back tears as he explained the finality of it all, how he had awoken one morning to find that the people who had been their support, their family, were simply gone. With both mothers gone, there was no one left to care for them. Isaiah, standing alone in the wake of such devastating loss, had looked at Lily and realized that he couldn't abandon her. She was too young to understand the tragedy that had unfolded, too innocent to bear the consequences of circumstances beyond her control. Despite his own grief, Isaiah made a promise to himself that he would protect her, that he would not let her face the world alone. He spoke of the days that followed, the long hours spent carrying her from place to place, searching for food, sometimes going without, so she would have enough. He told Ms. Harris how he had tried to make her laugh when she cried, how he would sing to her the lullabies his mother had once sung to him, and how, despite the difficulty, he had held on to her as his last connection to the love and security they had both lost. Isaiah's words were simple, but filled with a maturity far beyond his years. His story, revealing a sense of responsibility no child should have to bear. Ms. Harris listened in silence, her heart aching as she took in each detail. She glanced at the officers, who now looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet as they realized the depth of their misunderstanding. To them, Isaiah was no longer the figure of suspicion they had first seen. He was a boy carrying a burden far too heavy, a protector who had endured unimaginable hardship to keep his promise to a helpless child. Lily stirred in Isaiah's arms, and he instinctively adjusted her, whispering soft words of reassurance. She looked up at him, her face calm and trusting, unaware of the gravity of his words or the enormity of what he had taken upon himself. Ms. Harris, moved by the tenderness in Isaiah's gaze, understood that this bond between them was all he had left, the only thing anchoring him after everything else had been stripped away. The officers exchanged glances, visibly affected by the boy's story. What had initially seemed like a simple case of suspicion had become a story of resilience, of loyalty, of love forged in the midst of sorrow. They could see the exhaustion etched into Isaiah's young face, the determination in his eyes despite the hardship he had faced. The weight of their initial judgments hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Ms. Harris placed a gentle hand on Isaiah's shoulder, assuring him that she would help, that he was no longer alone in his efforts. Her voice was steady, but her expression was filled with compassion as she explained that they would work together to find a solution. She promised to help him find a place where both he and Lily could receive the care they needed, somewhere they could finally rest without the fear of what the next day might bring. Isaiah's eyes filled with a quiet gratitude, but his grip on Lily remained firm, his protective stance unyielding. He had spent so many days and nights guarding her, his promise as much a part of him now as his own heartbeat. Even now, in the presence of people who had heard his story and understood his struggle, he couldn't bring himself to let go. For him, Lily was not just a responsibility. She was family, his last connection to the love he had lost. As the officers and Ms. Harris looked at him, they saw not just a young boy, but a soul marked by tragedy and resilience, a child who had shouldered an impossible burden and borne it with strength that defied his years. The room fell into silence after Isaiah's story, each person weighed down by the enormity of what he had endured. Ms. Harris, the social worker, sat with a heavy heart, considering her next steps. Isaiah's tale had revealed not only his courage, but also his profound sense of responsibility for Lily, a bond that was both beautiful and tragic. But Ms. Harris knew the limits of the system, the rules that could not be bent, and the likelihood that Isaiah and Lily would have to be separated. She watched him carefully, still cradling the baby in his arms, his face a mix of love and fear as he looked at Lily. After a moment, Ms. Harris took a deep breath, her expression gentle yet serious. She explained to Isaiah that they would need to find him a place to stay, a place where he would be safe and have everything he needed. But she could see that Isaiah had only one question, his eyes pleading silently. Ms. Harris hesitated, then added gently that it might not be possible for him and Lily to stay together, that it was unlikely the system would place a 10-year-old boy with an infant, especially when they weren't biological family. Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of inevitability. The moment Isaiah realized what she was saying, his face fell, his eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. He clutched Lily closer, his small hands trembling as he processed the idea of being separated from her. The room felt as if it had grown colder, the quiet heavy with the sorrow and panic in his expression. To Isaiah, this was not just a bureaucratic decision. It was the threat of losing the only person left in his world, the one person he had promised to protect. Isaiah looked back at Ms. Harris, his eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away, and shook his head firmly. He began to speak, his voice cracking as he explained that he had promised to take care of Lily, that he was the only one she trusted, the only one who understood her cries and her needs. He reminded Ms. Harris, his words punctuated by shaky breaths, of the nights he had spent soothing her, the countless hours he had carried her, keeping her close, protecting her from a world that had already taken so much from both of them. The officer who had initially doubted Isaiah looked down, visibly uncomfortable as he listened to the boy's heartfelt pleas. He had arrived at this moment filled with suspicions, a conviction that he had seen a case of wrongdoing. Now, watching Isaiah's struggle, hearing the strength and sadness in his young voice, he felt an ache of regret settle within him. This boy, despite his age and small frame, was carrying a burden most adults would shy away from, a responsibility far beyond his years. And yet, Isaiah clung to that responsibility with an unwavering grip, his love for Lily anchoring him. Ms. Harris, seeing Isaiah's resolve, gently tried to explain the system's limitations. She told him that foster care placements rarely allowed children to stay with non-relatives, especially when one child was as young as Lily. She told him that despite her best intentions, she was bound by rules that often left little room for exceptions. Her words were meant to be kind, but they only deepened Isaiah's anguish. He didn't understand why such rules existed, why people who were supposed to care about children would allow this to happen to him. It felt as if the world was taking from him yet again, stripping away the last piece of family he had. As the reality sank in, Isaiah's quiet resolve broke. He begged Ms. Harris to find a way for him to stay with Lily, pleading with an intensity that caught everyone in the room off guard. His voice was raw with emotion as he repeated his promise, his words a testament to the love he had for her. He told her that he would do anything, follow any rule, prove himself in any way if it meant he could stay with Lily. Ms. Harris felt her own eyes sting with unshed tears, each plea cutting through her. She wished with all her heart that she could give him what he asked for, but the system she worked within was unyielding. Lily, sensing the tension, whimpered softly, and Isaiah instinctively rocked her, murmuring soothing words as he held her close. His tenderness toward her was heartbreaking in its simplicity, his every movement a testament to the care and love he had given her in the absence of anyone else. Ms. Harris struggled to find the right words to offer some comfort, but everything she thought to say felt hollow. Isaiah's heart was breaking in front of her, and she felt powerless to help him. The officer, who had been watching in silence, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, looking at Ms. Harris with an expression that was uncharacteristically soft. He murmured that maybe, just maybe, an exception could be made, that surely there must be a way to keep the two together. His voice held a hint of the regret he felt, an unspoken apology for the harshness he had shown earlier. Ms. Harris met his gaze, understanding the officer's remorse and sensing his desire to make amends. But she knew how rigid the system could be, how difficult it was to secure exceptions in cases as complicated as this. Isaiah's pleas grew quieter, his voice hoarse with emotion, but he held on to the hope that there was a way, that someone in that room would find a solution. His eyes, filled with determination, moved from Ms. Harris to the officer, silently begging them both to reconsider. They had the power to keep him with Lily, he believed. If only they could see how much it mattered. Every word he had spoken, every plea he had made, was an attempt to convince them to understand that he couldn't go on without her, that losing her would be losing the last part of himself. He had left. Ms. Harris placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her heart heavy as she looked into his tearful eyes. She told him that she would do everything in her power to help, that she would speak to her supervisors, reach out to everyone she could think of to see if there was a way to honor his promise to Lily. Her words, though earnest, carried a weight of uncertainty that Isaiah could feel. The officer, sensing the pain in Isaiah's gaze, reached out with a small, tentative gesture of support. He told Isaiah quietly that he understood now, that he could see how strong and loving he was, and that he regretted his earlier assumptions. It wasn't much, but Isaiah looked at him with a flicker of gratitude, sensing that in some way his story had changed the man who had once doubted him. As the room grew quiet again, Isaiah held Lily close, his heart aching, but his resolve unbroken. He knew the days ahead would be uncertain, but he held on to the hope that Ms. Harris and the officer would keep their promises to help him, to find a way for him to stay with the only family he had left. After hours of deliberation, Ms. Harris returned to the small room where Isaiah sat with Lily, resting peacefully in his arms. Her face showed the strain of intense discussions, but there was also a glimmer of hope in her expression. She approached Isaiah with a gentle smile, understanding that every decision made here affected his fragile sense of security. She told him she had found a temporary solution, something that could keep him and Lily together while they searched for a more permanent arrangement. Isaiah listened, his eyes wide with hope and relief, clinging to her every word. Ms. Harris explained that there was a supportive group home nearby with a special accommodation for young children. It wasn't a traditional foster home, but it was a place where Isaiah and Lily could be together. There, they would receive food, shelter, and the care they both desperately needed. She assured him that while it wasn't a forever solution, it would give him time to rest, heal, and remain with Lily in a safe environment. Isaiah nodded, the tightness in his chest easing as he realized they would not be separated after all. The officer who had once doubted Isaiah's intentions lingered by the door, listening to Ms. Harris's words with a contemplative look. Seeing Isaiah's relief, the officer stepped forward and cleared his throat, his expression softer than it had been before. He looked down at Isaiah, then awkwardly reached out his hand, placing it on Isaiah's shoulder in a gesture of apology. He admitted that he had made a mistake, that he had let his own assumptions cloud his judgment. Isaiah looked up at the officer, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and gave him a small, weary nod, acknowledging the apology, though the hurt from their earlier encounter lingered. Isaiah sensed the officer's remorse, a quiet recognition of the strength and resilience Isaiah had shown. As they prepared to leave the station, Isaiah felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He held Lily close, her small form warm and familiar in his arms, and whispered softly to her, though she couldn't understand his words. He promised her that they would stay together, that he would keep her safe. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Isaiah felt a glimmer of stability, a reassurance that their bond wouldn't be torn apart. Ms. Harris walked alongside them as they exited, watching Isaiah with admiration. His story had moved her deeply, and as she guided him and Lily to the waiting car, she made a quiet vow to do everything in her power to protect them. She knew that his strength, his willingness to shoulder responsibilities far beyond his years, was something special, something worth safeguarding. She had seen many cases in her line of work, but rarely had she encountered a child like Isaiah, one whose love and resilience had carried him through unimaginable loss. News of Isaiah's story soon spread within the community. The staff at the group home, local organizations, and even members of the community heard of the boy who had taken on the role of a guardian at such a young age. People were moved by his courage, and slowly offers of help began to come in. Families who had once felt untouched by the struggles of others found themselves moved to contribute, to offer support in whatever way they could. Efforts were soon underway to find a stable long-term placement for Isaiah and Lily together, a home where their bond could be nurtured, a place where Isaiah's sense of responsibility would be honored rather than torn apart. Each new offer, each act of kindness, felt like a step toward a future that Isaiah could now begin to hope for, a future where he and Lily might finally have a family to call their own. As the car pulled away from the station, Isaiah gazed out the window, watching the city lights pass by with Lily asleep in his arms. The uncertainty that had once haunted him seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of calm and purpose. Though he knew their journey was far from over, he allowed himself to believe just for a moment that they were heading toward something better. Ms. Harris, sitting beside him, glanced at the two of them and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the resilience she had witnessed. Isaiah's strength, his unwavering commitment to Lily, had touched the lives of everyone who had heard his story. Through his courage, he had not only protected Lily, but had reminded all those around him of the power of compassion, even in the most difficult of circumstances. For Isaiah and Lily, the path forward was still uncertain, but it was illuminated by the kindness of strangers and the promise of a life where they would no longer be alone. And as they arrived at the group home, stepping out of the car and into the warm light of their temporary shelter, Isaiah knew he had kept his promise to Lily, to stay by her side, to give her the love and security that had been so difficult to hold on to, and to build a new beginning, one filled with hope and possibility.